Christmas is an interesting time of year, a celebratory time full of fun and laughter that comes in the depths of winter, a season that would have been full of fear, food scarcity, and even deadly for our ancient ancestors.
Yeah, we're fine in our central heated homes, but our ancestors, they'd have been fighting the cold, searching for shelter, struggling to even hunt for food.
So how did so much joy come from a time which would have been far from joyful for most of human history? I'm Ollie.
And I'm Matt, and this is What We Did Before, the podcast where we chart the history of modern inventions.
Now, Matt, for a What We Did Before Christmas episode, you might think we'd be going down the whole Christmas used to be a pagan tradition route, which is, of course, real, that is a thing, and it's part of it, but there is so much more pre-Christmas history to explore besides, right?
Yeah, totally. We're going to be exploring all of our pre-Christmas history. What was winter like in Europe for the early humans who migrated there from Africa? What did we do before we'd invented any sort of winter's holiday celebration?
Yeah, we'll delve into Saturnalia, Yule, and how at one point, if someone knocked on your door, it was less likely to be a joyful choir singing lovely festive songs and probably a troupe of rowdy drunkards heckling you. And that was all before the Victorians reinvented Christmas to, what we sort of know it as today. But first, I'd like to explore how much of the Christmas folklore we celebrate today actually started out as quite frightening stories of mischievous monsters.
Yeah, so whatever you'll be doing this winter, and whether you celebrate Christmas, another winter holiday, or none at all, let us take you back to a time when Christmas, a holiday which very nearly didn't even become a thing, was not the most wonderful time of the year.
A quick warning before we get stuck in. I just want to say, for obvious reasons, this is not an episode to watch or listen to with young children. Anyway, let's start by discussing the creepy side of pre-Christmas and the many predecessors of the big man himself, Father Christmas.
Yeah, so Father Christmas has had many predecessors throughout the ages. Before the jolly, full-bellied man we know and love today, there have been a variety of characters throughout folklore who've taken on the job of judging the naughty and the nice. Usually, they weren't quite so forgiving.
Yeah, there's some really great examples. I mean, the Yule lads, for one, which is this folkloric tale from Iceland. And so these were 13 mischievous ogre boys, or sort of mountain-dwelling characters who would come to town at Christmas. And they were the sons of Gryla and Lepitheo. So Gryla is a female ogre, or an ogress, if you will, and she likes to cook naughty children in a big pot and eat their flesh. Lepitheo is, if I'm getting that right, is her lazy troll husband. So as far as I could read from my research, he's just sort of lazy and doesn't do anything.
Yeah, well, I can't speak for Lepitheo?
Yeah.
I don't know how to pronounce that, but Gryla has some Santa vibes going on. Well, the naughty children thing at least. And what about her sons then?
Yeah, maybe a stretch to say she's got Santa vibes. I guess she does judge the naughty, but beyond that, I'm not sure how often Santa's cooking and eating children. But the Yule lads, the apple doesn't fall that far from the tree. This group of 13 mischievous pranksters basically steal from or harass the general population. So they come to town one by one during the last 13 nights before Yule. And then they leave small gifts in the shoes of children. So children would place these shoes on windowsills and sort of await the gifts of the Yule lads. That sounds all nice. But if the child was disobedient or had been disobedient throughout the year, they instead left a rotten potato in the shoe.
Yeah, okay. So already we can see some similarities in a way to current Christmas, obviously, with a piece of coal in the stocking. It's a little different, but at least these Yule lads don't eat them.
Yeah, yeah, that's true. But they do have a pet who does.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so these ogres have a pet cat the Yule cat, which is a huge, vicious cat that eats people.
And why does the Yule cat eat people?
Well, specifically, he eats those who've not received any new clothes to wear before Christmas Eve.
That seems fair.
Yeah, it's capitalism at its finest.
Yeah.
But in modern times, I think these have all turned into somewhat more benevolent figures, a bit more like Father Christmas over the years. In fact, actually, they literally officially banned using these myths to instill fear in children in 1746. So woke.
Yeah, we need to go back to pre-1746, in my opinion.
Terrorize children.
Yeah, when we had proper Christmas. But even if we look at sort of Old Norse god mythology, the god Odin, known as the All-Father, he seems to have been somewhat of a Santa figure himself.
All-Father Christmas, if you will.
Such a highlight of my day when you speak to me, Ollie. So the All-Father Christmas Odin, during the Yule festival, he was said to lead a ghostly procession, and this was called the Wild Hunt. And this is when Odin was flying through the sky on his 8-legged horse Sleipnir. And children would leave food for Sleipnir in their boots or stockings, and Odin would reward them with gifts.
Okay, so the Wild Hunt could sort of be an origin story for the Christmas stocking, maybe.
Yeah, and we can also see, I think, some similarities to other Christmas traditions around the world with the putting gifts in shoes as well. Or
leaving a mince pie out for Santa, because he's sort of rewarding them with the gift for the food in their boots. Although I imagine that food would be quite rank after having been in the shoes of children who at that time in history probably wouldn't have had loads of pairs of shoes.
Yeah, I imagine so. And they probably didn't clean them super regularly
no.
either.
Poor Odin's going around. He's got terrible stomachache.
Well, it was food for the horse, so he probably didn't mind.
Oh, that's true. Poor Sleipnir.
And I suppose kids leave carrots, I think, out for reindeer, right?
They do,
for Rudolph. Yeah. So, more similarities there. So, but with the Wild Hunt, so apparently the hunters usually consisted of the souls of the dead, ghostly dogs, demons, fairies, Valkyries, and elves. Not scary at all. And there's actually a famous oil painting from 1872 by Peter Nicolai Arbo depicting the scene.
Yeah, it's an amazing image. It's really dark and foreboding. It's not Christmassy at all, though, is it?
I mean, it depends on your view of Christmas. Maybe for some of us, this is a good visualization of the chaos.
That's such a good point, actually. If you want to see a sort of a representation of the madhouse that is your family gathering at Christmas, just search this picture. So I wonder if Sleipnir, this is completely stupid, but I wonder if Sleipnir is where we get sleigh bells. No.
It's possible if we have the All-Father Christmas and Sleipnir. Then, the Norse gods, they had proto-Christmas right all along, I think.
Yeah, exactly. They did it the dark way, the heavy metal way, which we'd love to revisit. There are less frightening figures that led to Father Christmas, though. That was sort of the origin of Santa as we know him. Obviously, Saint Nicholas of Myra is the main one.
Yeah, good old Saint Nick.
Yes. So he was a 4th century Greek bishop from modern day Turkey. So Nicholas, I don't know if I'm on first name basis with him. Saint Nick, he was known for his generosity, particularly towards children and the poor. And, stories of his secret gift giving led to the European figure of Sinterklaas in the Low Countries, which is where the Americans got Santa Claus. Basically, that's how they derived the name Santa Claus. And because of this tradition, eventually over the years, gifts became traditionally exchanged on the eve of St. Nick's feast day, which is December the 6th.
Yeah, and while it's not a tradition anymore in our country. It's celebrated as a staple of the festive season throughout many, particularly European countries, with names such as Mikołajki in Poland, and usually this involves kids finding small gifts in their shoes or stockings. So, like we said earlier, so quite a pleasant and positive tradition still.
But over the years, Santa has he became paired with darker, more frightening figures.
I thought we were over the frightening ones.
Not quite, unfortunately. So the night before St. Nick's feast day on December the 6th, folklore in Europe tells of a frightening, horned, half-goat, half-demon monster who emerges to punish naughty children. And he's known as the Krampus. I actually watched this comedy horror film called The Krampus back in 2015 with my sister, and it was the first time I'd ever heard of the Krampus, actually, and it was just so stupid and just like this ridiculous. I mean, I didn't realize at the time that it was a comedy horror. I thought it was just a horror, and so I had sort of weird skewed expectations of it. I actually really loved it, but it was just so silly.
I remember seeing this. I never watched it, but I remember seeing it, I think in HMV or something, and I thought it looked ridiculous.
Yeah. It was, and it's worth a watch anyway.
So, since you've seen the movie, what I don't know if it's biblically accurate, but
Krampus from the Bible.
yeah. So, what is his usual form of punishment then?
So the form of punishment in the film, I do think, differs from what he's best known for. He likes to beat children with rods of birch.
Okay.
And the really badly behaved ones, he doesn't just like beat them more. He carries them straight into hell in a basket that he wears on his back.
I mean, it seems fair to me.
Yeah, I mean, I just use it as a gentle threat to my children these days. So it's all good. It's all in jest, isn't it? I'm going to carry you straight to hell.
You have mentioned Krampus to your children, though, haven't you?
Yeah, and I think it's fine. They're 5 and 2, and I think they need to know about these things.
Yeah. Well, as we said earlier, we need to go back to the pre-1700s wokeification of Christmas, right?
Exactly. I'm not woke. But actually, the Krampus will still be quite well known in some parts of the world because, like in the Alpine regions, for instance, places like Austria and Bavaria, they still celebrate Krampuslauf on the 5th of December. And this is basically a parade or a procession where people dress up as the Krampus and they dance and make loads of noise. It kind of sounds fun. I mean, the masks, they each have their own different interpretation, and so it's quite frightening. I wouldn't be taking my children, but I've got pictures here from Krampuslauf, and there are kids everywhere, so I think it's okay to teach my kids about the wicked old Krampus.
Yeah, I'm not judging at all, and I don't have kids, so I can't say what's good parenting. And obviously, it's also dependent on what they grow up with. A lot of the things maybe seem strange to us because we are used to a certain type of Christmas and it being all very, marketable and nice. But this is Christmas for them. This is a big part of it, right? And also in Alpine folklore, they have Frau Perchte, and she is particularly active during the 12 days between Christmas and Epiphany. She's a winter goddess. She's sometimes called the Christmas witch, or very nicely, the belly slitter. And this is all very festive so far.
So festive, yeah. I hope you're feeling joyful this season.
Yeah, 'tis the season for slitting bellies, apparently. So she judges whether people have been good and hardworking, and for those, she will reward them for being virtuous, while punishing the lazy and disobedient by, can you guess, disemboweling them and filling their bodies with straw and stones.
Oh, God.
Yeah.
What's wrong with these people?
Well, there are nice witches associated with Christmas too.
Good.
So you've got La Befana in Italian folklore, and she is a kind witch. She flies on her broomstick on the eve of the Epiphany, which is January the 5th, to deliver gifts to children. And legend says that she was invited by the wise men to see the baby Jesus, but she was too busy. I don't know what could possibly be more important, but she now forever searches for the Christ child and leaves gifts along the way.
It's a bit too late for that, I'm afraid. I mean, yeah, what could you, unless you didn't think that he was going to be the Son of God, it would be quite there's got to be something very important that's going on to miss that. I was too busy. Do you think I can still make it? It's only been, 2,000 years? There's also Dead Moroz, also known as Grandfather Frost in Slavic and Russian folklore. And so Dead Moroz is a winter wizard who brings gifts on New Year's Eve, and he's often accompanied by his granddaughter Snegirochka, the Snow Maiden, and his origins also predate Christianity as a Slavic supernatural figure of winter. So Santa figures are sort of everywhere.
Yeah, and we're already seeing a lot of the foundations for the traditions that we have now with gift giving, with Santa flying on his sleigh and delivering gifts,
I wonder, though, it seems that across the world, at least in the regions that we've spoken about so far, that there's this sort of desire for folkloric tales like this, and to have these figures, whether they are good or bad, or punish people or give gifts, whatever the case might be, it does seem like as humans we really want to create these figures. But don't you think it's weird that we have these folkloric figures at all, especially the violent ones?
Well, yeah, but there's a good reason all of these were developed after around 800 BC.
Yeah.
Because for our ancient ancestors, they likely didn't have time to come up with all of these fables. As we'll explore in other episodes, our ancient ancestors, of course, evolved in much warmer climates. So to make the move out of Africa and Asia, they needed to start fashioning shoes and clothes to protect them from the cold.
Yeah, so it's interesting because all of these figures emerging at that time clearly shows that we made a shift culturally and as a civilization, because we had the time, we had the, I suppose, the comfort to sit around and make up these stories, because ancient midwinter would have been a time mostly just for coping with freezing temperatures. We would have had shorter days, limiting foraging time. There was the snow, of course, making hunting way more difficult. Plants were disappearing. Water was freezing. It must have been extremely tough. And although a tough, difficult climate, one in which they can't come up with all these cultural figures, surprisingly, it seems that they did still make time for festivities and festive traditions.
Yeah, and this only increased, I think, as people developed their comforts and sort of became more centralized communities. But festivals and ritual gathering may have even been more common in harsh environments like this, because they were a tool for survival. If you think about it, gatherings like this would help groups to reinforce social bonds and reduce conflict and share resources and exchange mates.
Yeah, exactly. And when you're facing months of darkness and those freezing temperatures, you sort of need everyone on the same page. So sharing food, cooperating, not killing people over mammoth ribs would have been helpful.
Yes, definitely. And I guess we can sort of see, just as a general point, these kind of rituals and traditions and culture all being kind of tools to make sure that we survive and cooperate and increase morale.
And we have some evidence for this, right? This isn't just us imagining what it would have been like.
Yeah, we do. Although, of course, there are plenty of elements open to interpretation. So archaeology gives us these amazing snapshots. There are sites in Scandinavia like the Alta Rock Art Complex or the Komsa Culture sites, where we've found rock art from as far back as 11,000 years ago. So quite often this art depicts herds of reindeer, elk, bear, and clear hunting systems. So this suggests ancient hunter-gatherers were deeply connected to the animals and seasons around them, and possibly timed their big hunts for the harsh winter season. And because of all the animal imagery, this has led some people to believe that these hunts were more than just a search for food, but they also had symbolic, ritual, or even cosmological dimensions.
Okay, so kind of maybe close to being like a ritual or ceremony type thing, but still not quite Christmas.
No, true. But while we can't prove there was a fixed winter festival every year, it's not far-fetched to imagine that these hunts became communal rituals. They were gathering, feasting, storytelling, and having ceremonies rooted in deep respect for the animals that kept people alive through the cold.
Yeah, so, ceremonies or not, it's clear that our ancient ancestors, they had it rough during these early times. They existed in very small bands of people with limited shelter, limited tools, and food was hard to come by. So anything that they were doing in terms of rituals and ceremonies, I think, they would have been purely tools for survival.
Yeah, and you think about it that this is kind of like some superfluous thing that we have in the modern world because we're comfortable. But actually the opposite might well be true, that it was a necessity for survival. They wouldn't be giving up the resources, maybe eating more than they usually would, maybe spending more energy than they needed to, unless there was a particularly good reason for it. And once the Earth's climate began to shift and become more stable, and we exited the last ice age around 11,000 years ago, agriculture and permanent settlements became a real possibility.
Yeah, so at this point, we sort of moved out of... So this is sort of the shift, isn't it, that we're talking about? Moving from those really harsh ancient midwinters to a time when we were able to stop just being primitive foragers and hunters. So in this time, we suspect the wheel was invented after the end of the last ice age. So our settlements, they started becoming a lot more advanced. They turned from basic semi-temporary shelters made from wood, bones, and animal hides, like the mammoth bone huts that you find in Ukraine, into sort of huts and houses from the late Neolithic period that really start to resemble more modern homes.
Yeah, so I really just, we have some pictures of the huts in front of us, and I really recommend for anyone listening to look up the mammoth bone huts that Ollie mentioned from Ukraine. They're really fascinating. They look like something out of a movie or a video game, and yeah, they just look... They look metal.
They do.
Metal.
They got like these great big, the sort of the horns or the tusks are the entrance to the home. So they sort of create this circular entrance with the bones and the leather and the hide draped across it. It looks amazing, actually.
It does make me somewhat glad to be living in a house made of bricks.
Little pig, let me in. Yeah. One little pig made his house out of mammoth bones. And the wolf just was like, I'm not even touching that.
That sounds like a story to tell your children.
Yeah, okay, I'll add a fourth pig to the three little pigs for them.
Yeah, the one with a house made of mammoth bones. Yeah. And Krampus is knocking on the door.
Little children, let me in. Yeah, that's gonna give them a nice good night's sleep.
Yeah, well, I might not really recommend it to the parents out there, but
I told you this isn't an episode for children.
Yes, absolutely. We can see where the disclaimer comes from. But going from these mammoth huts to more permanent structures and larger communities and emergent cultures forming at a giant higher level of comfort, we believe we see more of an emergence in rituals and traditions. And this became more of the more recognizable beginnings of the winter celebrations that we have today.
Yeah, so we had time to begin developing our rituals, as we sort of alluded to before. Rituals, superstitions, religious beliefs even started to grow as these communities and cultures grew. And we can see evidence of this in the appearance of more elaborate megalithic structures and tombs.
Yeah, if you look at a site like Newgrange, for example, in Ireland. Now, this dates back to more than 5,000 years ago. The roof box over the entrance is aligned so that the winter solstice sunrise illuminates the inner chamber. And this only lasts for a few days around the 21st of December, which is the date of the winter solstice. So it's thought to intentionally be made that way to mark the solstice. And it was actually built 500 years before the pyramids. So it's one of the earliest confirmed solstice monuments.
Yeah, so you can kind of, you can see how you might view what they were doing at Newgrange as like an ancient festival of light. So, humans marking the moment when the world begins its slow return from darkness. And actually, the evidence of winter ceremonies at Stone Henge in the UK is also pretty strong. So Stone Henge, for those who don't know, is a megalithic structure which was built around 2500 BC. And archaeologists are now pretty widely in agreement that Stonehenge was fundamentally a winter monument. The rocks literally line up with and point to the winter solstice sunset, which is almost certainly deliberate. But the strongest evidence doesn't just come from how the stones are aligned, but it also comes from a nearby settlement. So Durrington Walls is where the builders lived, the builders of Stonehenge, and it was there that they performed seasonal feasting. So what archaeologists have found is ancient pig teeth from that settlement. And the reason that's a good clue is because most of the pigs seem to have been slaughtered at around 9 to 10 months old. And in Britain, piglets are born in the spring. So, just do the calculations, 9 months on from that would have been midwinter.
Right. Okay. So this is all evidence that there were feasts at this location, and we can make the assumption that it was during midwinter. And there's also, archaeologists have also found signs of lots of cooking and big communal meals, and even animals brought in from all over Britain. And this suggests that people were travelling specifically for a winter gathering. Some of the houses at Durrington Walls are aligned to the midwinter sunrise as well. Amazingly, Stonehenge opened up for the winter solstice again this year. It's just passed, which means humans, all these thousands of years later, are still gathering at the very same monument to celebrate this time of year.
Yeah, I find this absolutely incredible that people, the BBC did an article and as this podcast goes out, it will have just happened. The event is because it's the 21st of December, the winter solstice. And this picture on the BBC article is just fantastic. It's everybody, some of them topless, this is in the middle of winter, raising their arms to the sky, seemingly painted in blue, some of them. And, there's just something really ancient about these pictures. Primal, yeah, really primal. I think it's quite an amazing testament to what our ancient ancestors were doing. Like, I think we often look back in time and think our ancient ancestors were stupid, or, they didn't have the knowledge that we've got today, but they were doing things that we still find meaningful now.
Yeah, totally. There are cynical people who will look at this and say that these people, what are they doing? They're acting like they're, people from thousands of years ago and hailing the sun and the start of the longer days and things. But actually, I think this gathering of people, particularly in our age now, post-COVID, these things, I think there's a lot more meaning and a lot more power to these kind of things. They're much more necessary potentially than they have been for a while.
Yeah, I think our ancestors were marking the solstice and other events in different ways, but in particular the solstice in various different forms for a good reason, for thousands of years, for much longer than we've been living these sort of modernized lives, right? So we can't just, consign that to the past and say, oh, they were silly and we're not. I think we probably still have lessons to learn from what they were doing, because we even have sites like Goseck Circle, which also lines up with the sun during winter and summer solstices. And this was a German Neolithic structure built around 4900 BC. So it's not like this was just one place in time. This was happening everywhere. And so people sort of need events like this and gatherings like this. And we are losing that a little bit in a virtually connected world.
Yeah, it's totally easy to see why this tradition may have continued and evolved and also been so important to so many people. And this is kind of regardless of where they were in Europe. These practices seem to be ongoing independently in multiple places, thousands of miles away from each other, right?
Yeah, exactly. There's so many things that we haven't mentioned from this sort of period or slightly later, like the Karnak stones in France, for instance, which also align with the solstices. So it's clear that this was important.
And even in myths from Norse, Greek, Egyptian, even Japanese cultures, they all have these winter or solstice shaped stories where the sun dies or hides or battles darkness and then returns.
Darkness the band.
I think it's the darkness, but
yeah.
I'd love to see Justin Hawkins fighting the sun. That might be the coolest thing I've ever seen. Yeah. So these were all different cultures and different eras, particularly if we go with the example
darkness
that you just raised. It's a myth I haven't heard of until now, I must admit.
It's one I'm going to spread.
But all of these myths, in all seriousness, they all share a similar kind of emotional fingerprint.
Yeah, actually, there's something I really want to explore, and maybe it's not for getting too deep into this episode, but I do wonder whether there's like an individual person who can be attributed, if you go far enough back, to each of the emergence of these myths, like one dad telling his child a bedtime story, which kind of got out of hand. Like, how cumulatively do we come to shape these myths? I find that quite fascinating. Or is it really that there's one or two people who start the tradition and then carry it on, and they have no clue and no idea that it was just going to become this thing? The first person to ever say, the Krampus, should we just say that he eats children, and then now people are doing these massive ceremony like festivals in his name.
What an impact to make if those people only knew that the story that they probably just told their kid happens to now be 2,000, 3,000, maybe more years later, being part of celebrations
turned into a film.
Turned into a film. And that's just one example. So, yeah, it is fascinating to think about.
Well, we will get on to someone an individual who made a big contribution to Christmas. And I suppose that person probably doesn't know the cultural impact they've had. Now they're dead now. But, when they wrote this particular poem, whether or not they would have known where it was going to end up is highly unlikely. But one thing I do want to touch on when we discuss these points about sort of our ancient ancestors is that they weren't just celebrating the beginning of the end of winter. So, these pictures from the Stone Henge celebrations that we're doing in the modern day, they look celebratory, they look joyous, festive, but actually, many of these practices would have originated, they would have been driven by fear. These people would have wanted the sun to come back. They wanted a fruitful spring. They wanted their people to survive in these really harsh conditions. And they wanted their crops and animals to provide them with sustenance again.
And that will make sense. But did we see much evidence of that fear?
Yeah, so many of the sites where seasonal rituals took place also were found to be areas where offerings took place. So, things like weapons, animals, humans even being sacrificed or offered to gods, sometimes offered to spirits or actually just nature itself. And the idea is that this was a means of appeasing these forces to ensure survival during and after winter scarcity.
And these rituals continued as time progressed. But it's when we get to the Iron Age from 800 to 50 BC that we start to see more substantial evidence of formal religious reasons for these things. And while obviously written records are a little limited from this time, classical sources suggest that the Druids of the Iron Age Celtic religion also celebrated winter solstice. We really start to see the natural evolution of what we've spoken about already. Similar festivals and rituals largely focused around appeasing the gods so that the sun may continue to rise.
And we also believe the early forms of two of the most well-known formal winter festivals had their roots around this time. So these are Saturnalia and Yule. And although the more formal definition of these celebrations probably came a little later than the Iron Age. It seems that the idea for them was sort of seeded around this time.
So, although we think Yule may have had earlier roots and maybe more explicitly tied to Christmas, let's start with Saturnalia. So, Saturnalia was an ancient Roman winter festival, and it was celebrated between December the 17th and December the 23rd.
Which, of course, without sounding like a broken record, overlaps the winter solstice.
Yeah, exactly. So we can't get away from it that easily. But rather than just some theories or evidence of general rituals, we finally have a named, defined festival.
And it's named after Saturn.
Yes, Saturn, the Roman god of agriculture. This likely evolved from older agrarian rites, celebrating the end of the autumn planting season and midwinter, ensuring fertility of crops and livestock. So early forms may have included ritual sacrifices and feasts dating back to the pre-Roman practices from before 500 BC.
Yeah, I don't know why we don't do ritual sacrifices anymore. But this kept evolving, right? Practices, they started adding more practices to the celebrations. So we had things like, the normal feasting and even role reversals where slaves could act as masters for the day. And we even see some of the early forms of gift giving.
Yeah, exactly. In ancient Rome, we see our first evidence of pre-Christmas gift giving, which is, of course, a staple of our modern celebration.
Yeah, during Saturnalia, Romans, they would swap like small, deliberately playful gifts, so nothing like the big sort of tacky things that we receive today. So these might have been like joke figurines, maybe novelty candles, dice, mildly rude trinkets, things like that. And the idea was kind of to amuse rather than impress. And so actually at the heart of it was humor. So the gifts would have been way more modest than we're used to. But the idea was to sort of, spread light in midwinter and reinforce the festival's spirit of mischief and also equality. Because a big part of Saturnalia was this idea of sort of temporarily upending or suspending social rules.
Yeah, this is pretty amazing. It actually shows how even parts of Saturnalia have been absorbed by our current day Christmas traditions.
Yeah, I mean, it was a very popular festival, although it probably wasn't as important as Christmas is to us now. A lot of people loved it.
And I've, on that note, kind of dug through a few sources to find out what life was like for the ancient Romans during this period, so December 17th to the 23rd. For instance, there's a Roman writer called Publius Papinius Statius. I think that's how you pronounce it.
Very good.
He described some aspects of Saturnalia in one of his poems as part of his work, Silva. Now, Statius described a Saturnalia banquet hosted by the Emperor Domitian. The poem describes a grand feast, lots of guests, entertainment, and gifts given by the emperor.
Oh, yeah, you've read this poem, haven't you?
Yeah, I have. Not in Latin, I have to admit. I did use an English translation rather than reading it in the original Latin. So for those listening who are interested in reading it too, the poem is called Calendae Decembra. I apologise for anyone who does speak Latin if I've butchered that. But this poem seems to talk as if the gods will step aside and even celebrate this festival together with just normal people. And they would all together be enjoying wine, jokes, and some luxurious foods together. They named actually the types of foods, things that were not normal to have on a regular basis there. And all of this was said to symbolically surpass even nature's largest storm in grandiosity.
Okay, so you sort of see that there's this equality that they're trying to achieve. Like even the gods are coming down to the human level to enjoying the feasting. That being said, though, he was recounting quite a lavish affair. So we've got this idea of equality through it. But I don't imagine it would have been the experience for like the average Joe in ancient Roman times to have these incredibly luxurious, lavish feasts and festivals, right?
No. I imagine that it was what they were describing was kind of the feast with the emperor. So it would have been kind of for the real upper classes of the time.
Yeah, exactly. But I mean, as we mentioned before, there is this idea of like social roles being temporarily reversed. So even if they weren't doing something so lavish, they may have been still celebrating Saturnalia. And actually, within this sort of tradition, there would have been a ruler of Saturnalia. So this would be someone appointed during the celebrations, maybe somebody who was low status in a household, or perhaps otherwise not usually in charge. They would have been given the power to issue humorous commands to others during the festival.
Yeah, and in some ways, you can still see the similarities with modern Christmas. Just the concept of children being allowed to get away with a bit more than usual, or to be a bit more cheeky with the adults around Christmas.
Yeah.
So actually, around this time, there was also a phrase that went along with Saturnalia, which was Io Saturnalia. Now, this was a customary greeting during the festival from Io, an ancient Latin exclamation of joy or surprise or even triumph, and of course Saturnalia, the name of the festival. So even in meaning, it's basically their version of Merry Christmas.
Yeah, so it does sound like Saturnalia really did feel like a proto-Christmas.
Yeah, and we can totally see where we've maybe borrowed some things over time or how they've merged together, but Yule is definitely linked more closely to Christmas. As you may know, many of the traditions of Yule merged with Christmas during the Christianization of the Germanic peoples.
Yeah, so just remind us who the Germanic people were.
Yeah, so these were tribal groups who lived in Northern Europe and were identified by their shared Indo-European Germanic languages. They originated in southern Scandinavia, Denmark, and northern Germany, and they had a significant impact on European history. But by the early Middle Ages, they'd kind of been gradually getting converted to Christianity, and their traditions had largely died out. They were mostly absorbed by Christmas traditions.
Okay, so the Germanic people, their celebrations preceded Christmas.
Yeah, exactly. And this is where Christmas's pagan roots sort of begin officially. So ancient Yuletime was basically a pagan festival for marking the symbolic death and rebirth of the sun. Many believe it was a time for celebrating the winter solstice.
Take a shot every time you...
Yeah, this is an episode more aimed at adults, so we should have specified that at the start. But some sources say that Yule was actually celebrated after the solstice, so around the 14th of January, perhaps even as late as February.
Begging the question then, was it marking the winter solstice at all, or something else?
Well, it can also feel in the north of Europe like at the time of January and February, the sun doesn't rise at all. So maybe this is my theory.
And the north of England, I'll tell you. It feels like the sun doesn't rise for at least 6 months of the year.
But it could actually have had more to do with the phases of the moon rather than the sun. And this is to say, Christmas certainly isn't just a rebrand of Yule, even though people sort of use the terms interchangeably at the moment, or these days, I should say. I mean, Christmas takes place on the 25th of December, which obviously just doesn't line up. So Christmas is more of a blending of traditions.
Yeah, but even still, Yule has been co-opted by Christian Christmas. And Yule is the origin of things that we sort of know and love today, like the Yule log, right?
Kind of, yeah. It's not quite as simple as that. So in modern times, we think of a Yule log as a cake that looks a bit tree-like. I actually can't differentiate it from a Colin the Caterpillar, to be honest.
It doesn't have a face. That's the difference.
Basically, yeah. But they didn't have Colin the Caterpillar in Yule times. It would have originally been a large tree trunk that was burnt on a hearth. But this tradition seemingly originates in around the year 1184 as a Christmas Eve tradition. So the theory isn't that pagans had Yule logs and then we turn them into cakes. It's actually that the burning of the wood seems to have come from an older pagan tradition called something else. We're not actually sure what.
Okay, so basically, as part of these old pagan traditions, burning wood was customary, and then it just evolved over time and eventually ended up as a Yule log and a cake. But there are many more things to discuss about Yule than just Yule logs. So Yule has had a few different names. It's Yule, or I guess they're all pronounced similarly to Yule, but spelt differently. So in Old English, it would have been spelt Geol. You had Julius in Gothic, and you had Yol in Old Norse, which is J-O with an acute accent and then an L. And actually, neo-pagans, so modern day pagans like Wicca, they've even tried to revive the Old Norse term Yol with the acute accent over the O. So it's funny, you kind of got these people who, again, really want to relive the ancient traditions of our ancestors, maybe finding that there's something missing from the modern day ones. But I want to sort of delve into a little bit of what Yule time would have been like for the people celebrating it in its heyday.
So imagine this. You're huddled around great fires, surrounded by light, dancing, and merriment. Groups of people gather to feast on slaughtered cattle. Sacrifices are made to the gods, to the dead, and to the elves.
The elves?
Yeah, well, any supernatural being, really. The intention was just generally to appease them, so they wouldn't cause mischief or upset the usual process of the seasons, and perhaps to ward off bad luck and sickness. You've got to remember that this was a time when the supernatural was just a daily part of life.
There were other Yuletide traditions that have persisted too. So you've got the Yule goat. You might know this as an ornament that hangs on your Christmas tree. Usually they're made of straw and they're tied up with red ribbons. But the Yule goat would have originally been not just a decoration. It's theorized it may have been a way to appease the Norse god Thor, who rode the sky in a chariot drawn by two goats. And in Sweden, the Yule goat was even said to be this invisible spirit that would make sure people prepared properly for Yule.
I haven't really heard about the Yule goat before, to be honest.
Yeah, honestly, I hadn't really either until I started doing the research for this. But it did make me realize that something adjacent to the Yule goat that I see quite often. In fact, my neighbors have giant versions in their front garden. They're these straw ornaments wrapped in red ribbon, just like the Yule goat, but they're usually now, I would say, depicted as reindeer and not goats.
So it's interesting that we maybe see that the goats in this kind of winter festival context have become reindeer in our sort of modern day context. And maybe we even see that with, as you mentioned before, the Norse god Thor was riding the sky in a chariot drawn by two goats.
Yeah.
Now we have Santa riding the sky in a sleigh drawn by reindeer. So maybe this is also an evolution.
Yeah, so the Yule goat is just a victim of Thor being pushed aside for Santa. and goats sort of, they got the chop at the same time.
Yeah, it's not fair that we all have heard of Thor, but nobody knows about these goats.
Yeah,
yeah,
it's so unfair.
We need to rewrite the history books. But generally, if we look at pre-Christian traditions that we still do in some way today, you've also got things like wassailing. And this is basically house-to-house singing. The word itself comes from the Old English was hail, be healthy. And it began as a blessing shared over a communal bowl of hot spiced ale.
Yeah, but there were actually two different, very different forms of wassailing. So one was this door-to-door thing, where groups visited homes, they'd sing for food or drink, which is, I guess, the rough ancestor of today's Christmas caroling. But the other was far older and a lot stranger. This was orchard wassailing. So communities would head into their apple orchards on Twelfth Night or the Epiphany. They would choose the oldest tree, sing to it, pour cider over its roots, hang toast in its branches, and then fire guns to scare away evil spirits. And it was sort of a fertility ritual, which what they wanted to do was wake the trees during the darkest point of winter and coax a good harvest.
I really think we should still do this now. It's much better than the carol singing that we were forced to do at school. I'd much prefer to go to an orchard and basically get drunk and fire guns in the sky and sing to trees. That sounds awesome.
And pour their own guts back on them.
Yeah, basically.
I wonder if it worked.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, we're here today thanks to our ancestors, so clearly something worked.
Well, I'm assuming it wasn't thanks to them drinking cider and shooting guns. But anyway, over time, Christianity sort of eventually softened those rough edges that we see with wassailing. But the underlying idea remained the same. In midwinter, you gather together, you make some noise, you drink something warm and symbolically help the world come back to life.
Yeah, and actually the sort of rough side of wassailing, I think, is reflected in the lyrics, "We wish you a Merry Christmas." So you've got rowdier parts of that song where it goes "Now bring us some fig pudding, we won't go until we get some." So you wouldn't go round someone's house and do that now. Yeah, we still sing that song, and we never really think of the origin of where those particular lines come from. And I think they must have something to do with wassailing.
Yeah, so what we're saying, just to go back, because we only sort of touched on it, is that wassailing, other than the orchard variant, was a rough ancestor of Christmas caroling, but it was mostly kind of rowdy drunk people doing it, wasn't it?
Yeah.
It wasn't like this image that we have of Christmas caroling now where it's like a sweet family or a choir or something. They were actually it was more a bit like the kind of trick or treat. But with drunk adults.
Yelling for piggy pudding.
Yeah. But there's also this side note, and sort of touching on Halloween a little bit. Apparently, some people think that ancient Yule was kind of intended to be a Day of the Dead style event, with Odin, the principal god in Norse mythology, known as the Allfather, acting in his capacity as god of the dead. But this is disputed.
Even the good old-fashioned Christmas tree came from the Yule tree, and general traditions of bringing evergreens into the home during winter months, actually. So the idea is that these evergreens symbolized life and fertility.
Oh, what sort of things?
Well, everything you'd expect, really. Everything that you hear in the carols and the songs that we sing. You had holly, then that was, I think, to ward off evil. There was ivy for resilience and rebirth. Mistletoe would have been for peace and fertility, which I suppose makes sense because you kiss under the mistletoe. And then yew would have come into the house for the ancestors, like for death and eternal life. And there were all sorts of other evergreens that they would bring into the home for various different reasons.
And our modern version of a Christmas tree became part of German tradition by the 1700s. But they didn't become mainstream in Britain until they were popularised actually by the monarchy.
Yeah, that's right. So in December 1848, the Illustrated London News published this hugely influential engraving of Victoria, Albert and their children gathered around a decorated Christmas tree at Windsor Castle.
And that image went everywhere. Middle-class families across Britain wanted to imitate the royal domestic ideal. And not because of royal command, just because the scene looked kind of wholesome and fashionable and quite modern for the time. over the next decade, Christmas trees just became a staple of Victorian domestic life, a feature in department stores and public buildings, and just a symbol of family-centred Christmas celebration.
And we'll get into how the Victorians sort of cleaned up Christmas in a moment. But as you alluded to with wassailing, Christmas was actually very rowdy for a time.
Yeah, actually, a common tradition was the Feast of Fools, where a Lord of Misrule would be crowned. That was the term they used, Lord of Misrule. So this happened inside church communities, and the person crowned Lord would preside over the revelries and encourage wild behaviour and the temporary reversal of social hierarchies, kind of like we heard about earlier in Saturnalia. The whole thing was about kind of deliberately mocking church hierarchy and ritual.
Yeah, and at medieval carnivals during the Middle Ages, Christmas celebrations were often compared to like modern day Mardi Gras. So they involved heavy drinking, public feasting, and generally this sort of carnival atmosphere. And then you got all the wassailing, the general public disorder. The celebrations were so boisterous that in some cases, special guards were hired just for the Christmas season in case of alcohol-fueled riots.
Yeah, that's right. In fact, the first paid professional police force in New York City was instituted in 1828 in response to a Christmas riot. But then the shift towards a sort of tamer holiday came.
Yeah, so in the 16th and 17th centuries, the Puritans and other Protestant reformers actually banned Christmas celebrations in places like England and Boston, Massachusetts, because they viewed the holiday as an unbiblical excuse for riot and dissipation. And later, Victorian authors like Washington Irving and Charles Dickens, they promoted this vision of a more peaceful Christmas, this warm, benevolent holiday that brought people together across social classes. And that kind of helped reform the rowdier customs into what we see as the more private domestic celebration today.
Yeah, you can see a few angles here. Obviously, the Victorian monarchy. And then here we have A Christmas Carol, which obviously that's going to make it a lot more wholesome.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the Muppets Christmas Carol obviously being the best version.
Yes, I will agree with you on that one. I think.
Good.
Maybe
I won't break into song, but
yeah,
I do a good Kermit the Frog. No, I'm not even going to try.
Kermit the Frog. What was that?
That was awful. I do a much better version when I'm not chuckling.
Good. But other than these kind of more softenings of Christmas, the Victorians also commercialized Christmas.
No.
Yes, unfortunately. But it's important to remember that their version actually looked kind of nothing like the frantic, shopping-heavy Christmas that a lot of us know today. But with the advent of mass-produced toys and the emotional storytelling of Dickens, suddenly Christmas was a season you could market. And not just, alcohol companies. So Victorian gifts were still modest and deeply considered. There was, maybe you would get a handmade toy or a knitted scarf or a book or a box of sweets. Children usually received just one meaningful present, not mountains of wrapping paper and plastic. And etiquette guides actually even warned against giving anything too flashy for Christmas. This huge modern high-pressure gifting culture that we have today only really took off in the 20th century when post-war prosperity, advertising, and modern consumerism scaled Christmas into the giant industry it is now.
Yeah, like the Victorian version of gift giving doesn't sound horrendous to me. And I kind of love it, actually, like the simplicity, the intentionality, and with the modern way that we see gift giving, I don't know, it feels a bit hollow now. I think we've lost a little something along the way with all of our, sending wish lists out and set amounts of money that we have to spend on each other. I made this 6-part podcast about my grandma's experience being sent to a German internment camp during the Second World War, which you can actually listen to on the YouTube channel for What We Did Before. And it's called The Guernsey Deportees. And in the podcast, I actually asked her if they celebrated Christmas while they were behind barbed wire, while they were prisoners of war. And she said that they still did. They actually developed this really close-knit community in Biberach, which is the internment camp she was in. And it's an amazing story to listen to. But this particular moment really cut through to me. So even though she was only 4 years old, she vividly remembers the cardboard doll's house that her dad made for her. She said it had no lights. It was made from, essentially whatever he could find. But she loved it so much that she remembers it to this day. And I do wonder if kids these days will be able to recall presents that they received from the mountains that they get.
Yeah, I mean, an amazing story, firstly. I think it kind of buys into this idea that I've always had, and I think a lot of us have, which is that it's not about the money that you spend, particularly with children. You think that you have to buy all of these toys and things. Often it's the one kind of thing they really want that they care about and remember, and the rest is kind of just forgotten to time. And even at 4 years old, the significance of the cardboard doll's house that your grand's dad made for her wasn't lost on her. She didn't go like, oh, but I wanted this, I had a whole list and anything. This was something that really touched her, and she loved it and still loves it, and it's been a core memory for her life. That's amazing. So I think we can really learn something from stories like that. But sort of going back to the Victorian era and the Victorian experience of Christmas. So they, during this time, kind of also used Christmas to soften the grimness of the industrial age.
Oh, right.
Yeah. So cities were crowded and work was brutal and dangerous and child labor was everywhere. So there isn't really a comparison between your grandma's experience and, the Victorian experience, but there is maybe something that links the two, which is the fact that they even spent the time to celebrate Christmas in Biberach, and that it's this standout memory of a bit of positivity in what must have been an awful time. In Victorian Britain, there was child labour and, these difficult working and living arrangements. So this newly reinvented kind of nice Christmas that was being marketed a bit more and more of a wholesome kind of tradition, this became a kind of moral pause in the calendar. And factory owners would start offering rare days off or small seasonal treats. And the churches would promote Christmas charity as kind of a social duty. It didn't solve the industrial misery, but it briefly made the world feel a bit kinder than it actually was.
And if we could just pop back to old Father Christmas once more, since the Victorians are really the ones who turned Father Christmas from this minor folkloric figure into a central part of the Christmas celebration. So before the 1800s, Father Christmas wasn't a gift giver, and he wasn't especially important either. He was more like the personification of midwinter feasting, this sort of jolly adult spirit of eating, drinking, and good cheer. But when the Victorians reinvented Christmas as this warm, family-centered holiday, they needed a figure who embodied that new spirit. And, Father Christmas sort of came ready-made for the job.
Yeah. At the same time, though, the British Father Christmas sort of began to merge with the Dutch Sinterklaas traditions, and this was kind of arriving from America. So the Victorians effectively fused the two, the British spirit of Christmas and the American-style bringer of gifts. By the late 19th century, you get a recognisable Santa/Father Christmas hybrid. Jolly, bearded, friendly, associated with children, and appearing in cards, shop windows, and department store promotions.
Yeah, and this was the period when Father Christmas became a household presence. like a marketing icon really, and a key part of the Christmas story. So without the Victorian makeover, he'd have probably remained a minor folk character rather than the face of the holiday.
And what about his red coat? Everyone sort of credits Coca-Cola with that, right?
Yes. So Coca-Cola didn't invent Santa's modern look necessarily, but they did standardize it. So Santa before then came in all sorts of colours, like before the 1930s. So in Britain, Father Christmas often wore green or brown, which, because he was like a midwinter woodland spirit rather than this gift giver. And then early American Santas were often drawn wearing blue, tan, grey or even brown fur coats. And then European St. Nicholas figures, based on St. Nicholas of Myra, they wore red and gold bishop's robes that looked absolutely nothing like today's suits. So there wasn't a single style at all. Santa, he was basically like a shapeshifter depending on who was drawing him. But then Coca-Cola launched their advertising campaign with the Chicago-based commercial illustrator Haddon Sundblom. And his picture of this jolly, plump, red-suited Santa just went everywhere. It didn't, create the colour necessarily because there were red Santas that existed, but it froze that colour in place. So the bright Coca-Cola red became the Santa that the whole world agreed on.
But he was kind of depicted like this further back in time, descriptively at least, in Clement Clarke Moore's 1823 poem, A Visit from St. Nicholas.
Yes, this is the poem I read to my children all throughout Christmas. It begins, "'Twas the night before Christmas." Actually, for ages, I thought that was the name of the book. In fact, I think the book is called "'Twas the Night Before Christmas," but originally called A Visit from St. Nicholas. And it was the first known text to feature Santa's reindeer and connect them to the sleigh. And obviously he describes Santa in the poem as a jolly old elf with twinkling eyes, merry dimples, rosy cheeks. And this was quite strange, really, because up until then, Santa Claus was a figure traditionally depicted as like a thinner, less jolly, horse-riding disciplinarian. I imagine he was depicted a bit more like St. Nicholas of Myra, for instance.
And this poem even gave us the reindeer's names for the first time. And also this idea of Santa landing on people's roofs and sliding down their chimneys.
Yeah, I think it's amazing, actually. I've got the poem, like I said, that I read to my girls. And on the last page of the book, it says that it was anonymously posted in the New York Sentinel newspaper. And eventually it was claimed by Clement Clarke Moore. But actually, another New Yorker has laid claim to it as well, Henry Livingston Jr. But what I find truly amazing is that this piece of anonymously posted prose, potentially written by two different people, has echoed throughout the ages. It's had this massive impact on how we view Christmas, how we view one of the most important figures of Christmas. And whoever wrote it in the first place didn't even want to put their name to it. I wonder if any modern tales could ever have such a lasting impact on the Christmas tradition ever again.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine that anything would, right? It feels like everything's so steeply kind of ingrained in our culture. But I don't know about you, but I feel like I've actually already noticed a difference in Christmas from when I was a kid to now. I can't say that there's any particular piece to that, but maybe it's Americanization or generally like capitalism kind of. But I feel like Christmas has become more commercial. We see some small changes in kind of how we do things, like Elf on a Shelf, for example. That wasn't a thing when we were kids. And one thing that was added a little bit later, we mentioned that the reindeer's names were named as part of the poem. Rudolph was actually added in 1939 when Montgomery Ward created him for a Christmas marketing booklet.
Yeah, so things are changing already. And I mean, this isn't in our living history, but it's in fairly recent history. And I guess the people who celebrated Saturnalia probably didn't see this like one pivotal shift that changed Saturnalia into Yule or Christmas or any of these other traditions. So maybe modern tales and modern traditions are changing Christmas, but changes like that happen just so slowly we kind of miss them.
It would be fascinating to bring an ancient Roman from move them from a Saturnalia celebration to present day and show them how we're celebrating Christmas. I think they would be horrified. Or they might think it's amazing. I don't know. It
no
could go
sacrifices?
One of 2 ways. Yeah, where's the sacrifices? Why are your slaves not in charge here? Where are your slaves, actually? Yeah. What's going on?
Yeah, so as we wrap up and we come to the end of this absolutely mammoth deep dive into the history of Christmas, which I didn't realise would be quite so fruitful, I do think it's interesting to note that Christmas almost became a minor saint day that fizzled out. Early Christians, they didn't celebrate Jesus' birthday at all. Birthdays were seen as pagan. And when Rome finally introduced a nativity festival on December 25th in the 4th century, that actually arrived almost with no momentum. A lot of churches disliked the date that had been chosen. Some thought it wasn't a good idea to speculate about the date of Jesus' birth. Others preferred January the 6th, and most still saw Easter as the only truly important celebration.
And in some regions, Christmas barely caught on. It wasn't actually until quite a bit later, with Charlemagne choosing Christmas Day for his imperial coronation, and also with medieval Europe embracing the nativity through feasting, carols, and winter theatre, that Christmas finally grew into a major festival. Without that sort of cultural boost, it could have easily just remained a small, optional Saints' Day lost in the liturgical calendar.
Yeah, so perhaps one day, as we sort of discussed, we will have something else, something that will replace Christmas. And I really would love to know what that will be. Maybe a celebration of our AI overlords, perhaps.
I hope not. I hope not. And obviously, it's probably quite important to note that we're looking at the celebration purely from the traditions perspective. We're not sort of commenting on what we're actually, in the core of it, celebrating with any of these. So we're not saying that something will replace Christmas as, the celebration of Christ, if that's what you celebrate it for. But looking back in history, we have had winter festivals. Generally, I wonder what that might look like in the future. So just a final thought. I think it's quite common for people to think marking dates in the calendar or celebrating things like Christmas and New Year or even Valentine's Day is just sort of a cash grab, and that it's all a bit silly. But actually, this is something that we've done as a species for time immemorial.
Exactly. It's a bit of a modern luxury, I think, that we can choose to opt out of winter celebrations or call them silly or pointless. Because for our ancient ancestors, this wasn't just a bit of fun. It was about survival. Plus, marking dates in our calendar, writing New Year's resolutions, having a reset to the year, it gives life a useful rhythm. It stops us from feeling that we're eternally stuck in the situations in which we find ourselves. And it may seem arbitrary, but I think these things are important, maybe more important than we often give them credit.
Yeah, and while this may be a hard time of year for some and totally understandable why they might want to opt out of it, hopefully this podcast will be kind of taken for the intention that we've given and will help you to find new meaning in the holidays.
Well, Matt, I think that's a wrap of this mammoth episode. You've been listening to What We Did Before. I'm Ollie.
And I'm Matt. Have you got any ideas for an episode? Please let us know in the comments, and if we use your idea, we'll be sure to credit you in the outro.
Do subscribe if you enjoyed the episode. It helps us out massively, and we will see you next time.